Good morning, friends. Welcome to WordofGord's OBE Journal 2017. I think we're up to number 43, but I wouldn't make any bets on it. I don't know about you, but I thought I saw an orb dash in and out right at the beginning there. I'll have to check. I wasn't 100% sure. But then who is about anything? Especially in the astral plane, where beautiful illusions can be manipulated in many ways. As I saw just a while ago at multimedia theatrical style, maybe theatrical is maybe the best way to put it. I mean, there was dancing and art involved as well. Maybe they don't call it anything. But in one of the, I don't know, mid-astral plane paradise level cities where much is going on, just like any city anywhere. And but in the elevated, refined astral plane style, where everything seems quite breathtakingly beautiful. And the people, the buildings, the surroundings, they're like the most modern of cities one would see around the world, but even more beautiful in terms of the shapes of the tall multi-story buildings, all sorts of curves and angles, and almost spheres in the middle of elongated rectangles, and well, all sorts of geometrical shapes, and like the onion domes of the certain types of Eastern Orthodox churches, a lot like that, but magnified by 10 or 20. And it's just quite dazzling when you're there, and you know you haven't seen it all, even if you've been several times. And you just enjoy it. And I'm trying to do the enjoy plus thing so I can report on it. And I'm not quite there yet. I'm too busy sort of enjoying it, or the astral Gordon is anyway. And so I'm in this performance space in a building, a building, a gorgeous mini museum devoted to the arts and crafts, all kinds. And I've been there before. It's a multi-level building with different areas devoted to different artistic pursuits. But the performance space I'm in now is, let me try and describe it for you. It does have a low stage at one end, and the usual sort of entrances and exits on the side, and a curtain, and you know, that sort of a thing. But it's not fronted by rows of seats. There are seats spread around, but they're more in little groupings, and comfortable, easy chairs in groupings of 4 and 5, and around. Are there little tables? Yes, there are little tables. there's nothing on the tables in terms of, drinks or food, but I think it can be used for that on other occasions. It's quite a large room, large square room, high ceiling, um, and there's framed art on the walls. And not a lot of framed art on the walls, maybe 10, 15 large, frames with fairly traditional paintings on them, or what appear to be paintings, and some of them are representations of dancers in various poses. Maybe pose isn't even the right word. It suggests they've stopped and are holding a position for an artist who's going to replicate it. No, it's almost like snapshots in mid-flight or something. And some of the moves are sort of balletic, some are more modern dance. Some seem verging on gymnastics, as ballet often does. And I'm there, and obviously I'm there. And the place is, most of the seats are taken by others who appear to be an audience. I'll say appear because in this realm, things are always, little surprises. And at a certain point, I can say it's quite a large room, plenty of spaces between the little assemblies of easy chairs, and it, like I say, a sense of expectation, a sense of a thrill about to be bestowed, and like I say, I've been here before for various other performances, but I don't really know what this one's about in terms of the theme or, descriptions that might have been given out ahead of time. It's just a place you go to have a unique experience. And the lights are dimmed, although I never noticed them in the first place. And the room gets dim, although not dark, and dim enough that you can barely see from one end to the other. And then a sort of a light show begins. It's subtle. It's not as overwhelming as the light show, say, in an elaborate rock band performance. But there are beams of light sort of playing around, and the colors I'm seeing are a sort of a soft peach, some indigo, some sort of mossy green, but pale, pastel-y, not bright. And they're sort of playing around like this. And I mean, they're coming from somewhere, but it's hard for me to tell where. And I'm too busy, again, sort of enjoying the interplay. And somebody's manipulating them somewhere, but I can't see where. And it might be, you know, some laser beam setup. And so enjoying that, and I'll sinking into it. It's quite quiet. I'm sort of wondering if music will show up, and it hasn't so far, but we seem to be enmeshed in these, you know, lights, beams, and beams that sort of break out of being beams and have little tendrils and arms coming out from the beams, as it were. Uh, at a certain point, a slightly stronger spotlight, not really bright, but stronger than the others, a little more intense, sort of a lemony color, focuses it focuses attention on one of the large paintings, and it's a painting, or it seems to be a painting of a couple of dancers, and in mid-flight, mid-pose, and as we look at it and admire it, um, it comes to life, and they start uh, continuing their dance. And it's a sort of a combination of, almost classical ballet and into more modern dance, sort of thing I've seen, one can see here on Earth, but they are sort of floating midair. There's not much of feet touching the ground, and as we watch them do their display on the within the frame, they suddenly burst out of it, the two of them, and man and woman. And although I tell you it's pretty omnisexual, it's hard to tell which is which. And they're continuing their dance moves and twirling and floating slightly above the floor uh, as they move in the open areas between the seats. And lovely, breathtaking, sort of exquisite movement that in some way replicates the dance of the lights that I tried so poorly to describe a few moments ago. Um, so just try to see that. And they have costumes, but fairly sort of brief, flowing, you know, outfits, nothing too elaborate. And but it's the dance moves, the sort of graceful balletic gymnastics that they're going through with each other. And as I say, they're moving between the little groupings of seats in a pre-planned fashion, I'm sure, but I can't quite see the plan myself. And it is so entrancing just watching. And music is arising from somewhere. It arose very slowly. I didn't notice it at first, and I can't see any musicians, so it's a recording of some kind, and it feels like violin, flute, and keyboard to me, violoncello, flute, and keyboard, I think. And it's textural more than rhythmic, and contrasts nicely with the very rhythmic nature of the dance. Sometimes dance tells a story, and I'm not seeing a narrative represented here, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. I'm just not seeing it. I'm seeing I'm catching the aesthetic moment here, the beauty of movement and light. As I say, many positions and moves and steps that you would recognize from, or variations thereon, that you would recognize from classical ballet and modern dance practiced here, but done with sort of more effortless grace, because the astral plane has very, very low gravity, and it's easy to sort of, if you intend to do so, float and fly about. So some of this dance is done in diagonal and horizontal positions above the floor. And nobody seems very surprised about that, but that's, I think almost everyone here is an astral plane resident. I'm just I get the feeling I'm the only visitor. And as they make their way in a mysterious fashion around the room, with us watching and feeling and seeing, or well, not watching, seeing, feeling entranced, quite entranced. It's quite remarkable how into this you can get, and eventually, as you may have guessed, they make their way around and go back into the painting and solidify into the pose. And the music fades a bit, and it doesn't disappear, sort of fades. Then another spotlight seems to come from somewhere, and again, a sort of a slightly more intense than the other spotlights that are still playing around like this, and illuminates another, or draws our attention, or whatever you want to say, to another frame on the wall. And what is represented on this? It's a man seated. The representation is a male human seated in a room with a number of not very large sculptures. That all, he's seated, and around him are a number of maybe 10, 8 sculptures on small tables, sort of abstracts, really. A little bit like Henry Moore, a little bit like Giacometti. I'm just running off names here. I'm not saying that that's who did these. And he's sitting there in the image, seeming quite rested and relaxed, and not really looking, surrounded by the sculptures, but not looking at them. And it's a representation of like a small room in a workshop, or you know, an artist's den of some kind. And the music sort of rises a little bit, and again the figure comes to life, and he sort of moves up out of his chair and becomes, you know, three-dimensional, at least three-dimensional, and walks around the sculptures that are on the small display tables around him, and picks up one of them, and it looks like sort of marble, alabaster material, and with the music becoming slightly more rhythmic, I noticed, but the same kind of violin, cello, flute, keyboard sort of sound. He floats out of the painting, it's the best I can say, and begins to sort of yeah, he's erect, and then he goes like horizontal. He's floating around, like gently floating around, and as you know, flying on the astral plane is no problem. But he's not whizzing about. He's sort of clouding about, quite slowly and delicately, and you know, subtle movements, subtle variations in limb position, and he's horizontally moving around between the seats, the groups of seats. As I say, there's plenty of space between the seats. I'd say 12 to 15 feet at least between the groupings of seats, and not in any regimented fashion. A sort of a, you know, bit of a maze or a hodgepodge, but plenty of room to do what he needs to do. And as he's moving around and he's holding the sculpture, he's sort of turning it so that you can see, as he goes by various groups of people, he's turning it so you can see the different aspects and angles of the sculpture. And he's not by me yet, but I can see over that he's doing this. And he's moving so, shifting so gracefully as he slowly floats around, that he becomes a sculpture himself, a moving sculpture. And quite lovely, quite lovely. The human body as a morphing sculpture. The sort of thing that dancers can do that everyone else goes, gee, how do they do that? And really quite entrancing. As I say, very slow, subtle, you know, this sort of thing. And the music that's being played is very appropriate for this drifting, morphing, you know. If you've stared at clouds in the sky and watched them carefully change shapes as they move across horizontally, it's a bit like that. Slightly, the morphing's a little faster, but not much. And he, as I say, he goes slowly around the room, and like I say, he never stops sort of slowly twisting his limbs and his body. And twist is even slightly too harsh a word. But his body, of course, appears sort of very rubbery and loose and flexible. But then dancers' bodies often do, don't they? And as I say, he still got the sculpture in his right hand, and he sort of, moves it around so that people can see it. As I say, it's a small, maybe foot, foot and a half long um, shape, etched into something that appears to be somewhere between marble and alabaster. And as it moves through the lights that have been going on all this time that I described at the beginning, it takes on various textures and shades. And perhaps it's just a pale cream to begin with, but it absorbs and reflects the various lights that hit it, and as does the dancer. And I'm watching as he gets closer to me, and quite lovely, and the gracefulness of it all is just stunning. And when he comes close to me, as he's coming now, I'm watching as I have been all along, and for whatever reason, when he gets to me, he holds out the sculpture right up to my face, and turns it slowly, so that I see all the little curves and indentations, and of which there are many, and get to marvel at the intricacy of it all. And then he kind of slowly floats away and goes to the next grouping. And the music has a very sort of textural rise and fall. Reminds me a little bit of, I don't know if you've heard the music of Gavin Bryars, Here on Earth, but reminds me, you can find plenty on YouTube. A little like the delicate rise and fall, textural rise and fall of some of his pieces. And eventually he's moving, back into position in the painting. But again, very slowly. Takes an upright position, merges into the chair. Puts the sculpture down where he had picked it up, and merges into the chair. And his movements stop, and he becomes once again a painting, or what appears to be a painting. I'm not sure. I don't think I've been repeating this in real time. I might have shortened it a little bit in memory. I think it went on, I've been chatting here for nearly half an hour, but I think it went on a little longer than that. And when it came to a halt, the things slowed down. They didn't exactly stop, and the last thing to fade was the lighting and the music, the soft play of those pastel-y spotlights with various tentacles and arms sort of coming out of them and curling around. And the music, it all sort of faded very, very slowly. And as though, like a dimmer switch and turning the volume down, but by tiny increments. And eventually, when it all stopped, we sat in silence, very relaxed, refreshed, elevated, entranced. And after a few moments of silence, I would say, yes, silence, applause begins, and eventually everyone stands up, and the dancers appear. That's the man and the woman, and the man doing a solo dance up on the stage. They were never on the stage to begin with. They were in the paintings that were around the room and come from the side of the stage and take a bow in a way that you would be familiar with. And the applause is generous and appreciative. And without being, I guess it would stop short of rapturous. I don't know quite why I'm saying that. No hysteria. I think we're all so laid back and calmed by what we have seen that the sort of excitement that you might see in another performance is not quite there. But certainly the pleasure and the serenity, the serene pleasure is there. And then they go off stage, and we all kind of stand smiling at each other. Some people sit down again, and various quiet conversations begin. Some people get up and leave, and I get up and leave. And I guess I'm doing this for the benefit of relating. And we walk out of this large room, and there's a kind of a lobby type room outside with more comfortable chairs, and a serving area that seems to have various items of refreshments available, as you might see in a theater lobby or a cinema lobby. And I walk up with some other people, and I see various little, descriptors, and I get a sort of a mango raspberry juice. Can actually see the label. There's plenty of other things, but I pick up this mango raspberry juice in a very beautiful glass, bulb-shaped glass, and sit down and begin to sip. Some other people sit quite close to me, and I smile and nod, and one man asked me how I enjoyed the performance, and I said it was just marvelous. I'm so glad I came. And he said, yes, we haven't seen you around here for a while, and I guess you have other things to attend to. And I said, or Astral Gordon anyway, said, yeah, I'm a bit of a traveler, and I report on my travels for those still, clamped into position on Earth. And when I say clamped into position, he sort of chuckles, understanding what I mean, I think. And with a reference to the performance, they're definitely not clamped into anything. They're very free. And he says something about, sounds like you've got a bit of a project going. And I say, yes, I am. I'm discussing what I experienced when out of body um, on YouTube, on the internet. And he says, "Oh," he takes a sip of his juice and says, "Sounds good. Sounds very good." When he says, "When I was on Earth, I had no clue about what was going on here. I was, you know, focused on my day-to-day life." And what do I say? I said, "I guess spiritual yearning wasn't your cup of tea, was it?" And he said, "No, not really. I was pretty focused on my job, and and a fairly good life, and enjoyed the benefits of a high earning capacity, and was caught up in the what did he say, the luxuries I could afford. And then when I wasn't enjoying the luxuries, I was working hard to attain them." And we discussed that whole, sort of situation of values and attitudes and lifestyles that you sort of inherit from your parents as a given, thinking that you're being wildly original in your choice of career and lifestyle, and then realizing later you're sort of replicating your father's values in a slightly different mode. And I asked if his parents are here, and he said, "No, actually, I had a heart attack when I was quite young. I was only 34, and it was just a sort of a very sudden thing with no warnings. And I just clicked out in a matter of moments." And he said, "But that's all past now. I don't care about that anymore. I used to be upset about it for the longest while. Felt had been ripped off of my wonderful life. But when I stopped being annoyed about it, I realized a wonderful life here was just as wonderful, just as easy to access." And then we chat a little more, and then he excuses himself and says he has to meet a friend, and off he goes. Around me in the lobby, there's other people sipping on drinks and chatting away, just like they might do here on Earth. And no one else approaches me, and I decide to leave myself. And there are other things that I asked for Gordon did that last night, a few hours ago. I think I can see there's some, I'm not going to describe it because we haven't got the time, but sort of retrieval work. Just fairly standard stuff, talking to people that have just died in car accidents, I think. And a couple of guys that have been shot. We've had a little burst of shootings here in Toronto, gang members, I would suspect. And they're pretty earthbound. And there's a couple that I was trying to work on and convince to move on, but unsuccessfully, too motivated by anger and thoughts of vengeance. So there's a bit of that. And some journeying around. But similar to things I've described on other episodes. And if I was to describe them again, I think it would just be a repetition. So I'll leave it at that for now, and leave this episode and devoted to the arts and crafts, not really crafts, arts display that I attended last night, or that Ashford Gordon attended, and then, after all those other activities, came back into this body that is talking to you now. And again, another example of continuous night by night OBE activity that we can experience and can remember experiencing if we choose to do so. And I realize it's time and effort, and I'm blocking out big chunks of time in my daily life right now in order to do this. But I do feel it is worthwhile. I do feel it is a revelation, and it was something I assumed was going on without knowing particularly, and I've turned that assumption, that confident assumption, into a conscious knowing that I'm communicating, and in the hopes that will inspire others to do the same, because I sense that as we do our explorations, we are moving, however gradually, to round the clock consciousness. So there are no drops in consciousness. There's an orb, my goodness. Hello. Well done. Wasn't that nice? Thank you very much. And continuous consciousness, the sort of thing that you'll see referred to in the old esoteric books. They'll talk about ascended masters having 24/7 consciousness, never not being conscious and aware of what's going on various planes simultaneously. And realizing their multidimensionality as a moment by moment reality rather than something they dip into when they've got time. And we are all moving towards that too, as I say, however haltingly and slowly. We are moving towards it, and I hope these episodes of the OBE Journal are helping build that bridge towards that reality for me and for all of you who participate. I'm not going to put any timeline on this. I don't think there's any point in that. And as I've discussed in other episodes, many things on the planet, many events, many sequences, many processes continue on, even if they're sort of destructive and negative and not particularly, creative, despite what explorers are doing. We have to accept that. So, as we move into multidimensionality, bit by bit, slowly, gradually, but without falling back, elsewhere, shit still happens. And we have to get used to that. The entire population of the planet is ascending tiny increment by tiny increment, but some of us are in the vanguard and we're whipping along a little faster. And that's all well and good. Every movement needs a vanguard, and it needs laggards at the back, and it needs a big mass of souls in the middle that are following along. That's the way of life. That's the way of humanity. That's the way of incarnated spirit. So enjoy and don't despair.